What is going on, Chess YouTube? In today's video, we are looking at the absolutely savage game played between Magnus Carlsen and Hikaru Nakamura in the Freestyle Chess Grand Slam tournament happening right now. This game was insane. Magnus ends up sacrificing the knight to win the game at the very last second. It was a shocker. Let's dive right in.
In the game, he does open 1d4, and I do want to point out, instead of 1d4, the best moves here, according to the engine, are d4, e4, f4, and the alpha 0 move a4. Instead, 1d4 chosen in the game, and black does the same, 1d5. Then here on move 2, Magnus going to f3, potentially intending a fast e4 break, and you don't see it very often in classical chess, but I guess it works out here in freestyle chess. And how is black going to respond? He plays a very curious looking move, bishop b5, flying out with the bishop. The idea being, if white goes e4, then you lose the bishop on the f1 square as that bishop is pinned. However, overall, this move, bishop b5, is not that strong. And here white simply goes a4, gaining space on the queen side, driving back that bishop. Where is it going to go? It goes bishop a6. Now, again, that pawn on e2 is still pinned to the bishop on f1. That is the idea behind this sequence. All right, from here, Magnus continues, knight to f2, developing his knight to that f2 square that was made vacant by the move f3, and black is going to respond with the move knight to g6, jumping out with his knight, a very decent idea. Now Magnus, knight d3, traveling over with the knight, the idea being now that pawn on e2 is free to enter the board. It is no longer pinned. And how is black going to respond? Well, he decides, you know what, it is time to get rid of that bishop. He goes bishop takes d3, now white goes rook takes d3, recapturing, and now he finally breaks in the center of the board with the very provocative move e5. Now the idea being, if white takes on e5, the knight recaptures back, and then black is targeting the rook on the d3 square with that knight. That would be very, very strong. White in response goes e3, bolstering the pawn on the d4 square rather, and then we have knight to f6, jumping out with that knight. Now here Magnus, he gets very creative with this rook. He's a little bit concerned. He's concerned about the idea of, if you take on e5, black recaptures with the knight, again putting pressure on that rook on d3. Therefore here, he actually plays the move rook to b3. The point being, now white is setting up bishop to a6 ideas, and that pawn on b7 would be pinned to the king. I do want to point out though, there were plenty of other ideas instead of rook b3. For example, right here, the move g4, potentially intending g5, driving back that knight, is actually the top engine choice, but rook b3 is the second best engine move. Again, the idea being bishop to a6 coming up. And what is black going to do about it? Well, he goes a6. Now, normally you don't want to go a6 in this sort of scenario, as then bishop takes a6 would win the pawn. However, here, the rook on a8 does guard that a6 square. Therefore, if white takes on a6, then the rook takes back, and then black is up a piece. So instead, right here, white does go g4, gaining space on the king side, threatening g5, threatening to push that knight back away from the f6 square. Now, what is black going to do in response? Well, he decides it is time to break on the queen side, and he plays the very strong move c5. The point being, now there is a tremendous amount of pressure on that pawn on d4, and this move is very strong. However, there were plenty of other ideas. For example, the computer quite likes the idea of king to a7 here, kind of a strange looking move. There are plenty of other weird ideas. E takes d4, also very playable, but instead c5 played in the game. Now again, we have just a tremendous amount of pressure on that pawn on d4. Where is that pawn going to go? What is white going to do? Well, you can lead the pawn on d4 and allow black to capture, or you can take on e5 or c5. In the game, the move d takes c5 was chosen by the GOAT, a perfectly fine move, and black again can recapture the bishop or the queen. In the game, queen takes c5 was chosen, activating the queen, but leaving that bishop back on the f8 square, where it isn't doing a whole lot yet. All right, now Magnus, his big problem here, well, number one, his rook on a1 and his king on b1 are a little bit awkwardly placed. Beyond that, the bishops on f1 and e1 are a little bit passive, and that knight on g1 also not doing a lot. So Magnus here has to get his back rank pieces into the game. So he starts knight to e2, potentially intending knight c3. That would be a very good square for that knight. And Hikaru has the same problem. He's got to get his pieces on the back row into the game. He goes bishop d6. Oops. Bishop to d6, developing his bishop, a perfectly fine move. However, there were plenty of other stronger alternatives. For example, king to a7, knight d7, and so on were a little bit better. Instead, bishop d6 chosen in the game, getting that last piece in. And now here, Magnus, instead of knight to c3, he actually goes the other way with the knight and goes knight g3. So, knight g3 played in the game, and this move is very interesting. Potentially, white wants to go knight f5, forking both the bishop on d6 and that pawn on g7, forcing something like bishop to f8. Again, there were plenty of other good alternatives. Rook c3, hitting the queen on c5 is very strong, as is g5, driving back that knight on f6. Instead, knight g3 chosen in the game, again, eyeing that very weak f5 square. And Garry Kasparov once said, a knight on f5 is worth at least a pawn, and that may be the case here. That knight would be a monster. And overall here, Magnus does seem to have a very large advantage out of the opening. Yes, black has those good pawns on e5 and d5, but overall, his pieces aren't coordinating that well, and white has a lot of pressure on the king, on the queen, the knight coming to f5, and so on. And what is black going to do? Well, he knows you simply cannot allow that knight to go to the f5 square. With that in mind, knight to e7 chosen in the game, guarding f5s with the knight. Now here, how does Magnus continue the attack? He goes rook to c3, sliding over the rook, pressuring that queen on c5. Now, of course, the queen is going to have to go somewhere, and it turns out the only good square for the queen, this is very awkward, is the a7 square. If you go anywhere else, white's going to have way too many aggressive ideas, potentially a5 and so on, rook a3 and so on, getting the attack going. So he does go queen to a7 in the game. Again, if you don't do that, white's going to have way too many ideas. Now here, white continues with the alpha 0 attack. He goes a5, clamping down on the queen side. Now this a pawn is technically a fighting piece. It controls b6. This makes ideas like b6 or b5 virtually impossible to achieve later in the game, and it's very interesting. The king started on b1 and b8, and they basically stayed there. And here, white has somehow managed to bring all of his pieces over here. The bishop slicing down the board, the rook slicing down the c files and the a files, the queen very close to entering the game as well. And Magnus has just a completely dominant position right here. All right, Hikaru, he goes bishop b4, pressuring the rook and skewering the bishop behind the rook. Now we have rook b3, and then Hikaru continues his idea. Bishop takes e1, and then queen takes e1 was played in the game. Now Hikaru, he's got to defend. He goes knight to c6, bringing his other piece over to the defense. Of course, that pawn on b7 defends the knight, but it is pinned to the king. Therefore, white has some ideas, potentially based on, say, queen to c3, targeting that knight on c6 immediately. Now, before doing that, he finds a very aggressive move, g5, gaining space on the king's side. Now, this may have been a little bit premature. Instead of that, the more obvious move may have simply been knight to f5, jumping in with the knight to the very weak f5 square, targeting g7, but instead g5 played in the game. Hard to argue with this move, a very typical open Sicilian style move, again, driving back that knight. Now, d7 is the only decent square for that knight, and that is where it goes. Knight d7 chosen in the game. I mean, where else could you go? h5 is occupied, or not occupied, defended by the knight. The only other squares were e8 and g8, and overall, d7 makes quite a bit more sense than those. And here, after a couple of slightly inaccurate moves by Magnus, Hikaru seems to have equalized according to the computer. Now here, how does white want to proceed? Well, there are a few different ideas the computer likes. For example, e4, f4, potentially knight to f5, and so on are all decent. Instead, though, in the game, bishop to h3 chosen, targeting that weak knight on the d7 square. Now, black continues. Queen to c5. Of course, that knight is defended for now. There's no need to over-defend that knight. And again, Magnus, he has to find some way to justify sort of his awkwardly placed pieces right here. Black still has that good central control, and unless white can get some sort of attack going, that central control will mean more in the long run. All right, from here, white continues another very strange move. Knight to h5, targeting the pawn on g7. Now, this looks active, but overall, the action is happening on the queen side here, where the kings are located, and this knight does risk being misplaced. Instead of that, there were plenty of other moves again. For example, rook a to a3, developing the other rook may have been a little bit smarter. Now, of course, that pawn on g7 is being attacked. Hikaru respects that. He goes queen to f8, the best way to defend the knight. Instead, if you go, say, g6, that makes too many weaknesses on the dark squares on the king's side. For example, f6 and g7 are very, very weak. speak, in that scenario. Instead, queen to f8 played in the game, defending g7, a very precise move. And now, how does white want to continue in this position? Well, Magnus, he goes for it on the king side with the move f4. Very strong. He's potentially threatening something like f5, gaining even more space, trying to clamp down on that side of the board. And of course, there is a little bit of tension on that pawn on e5, but that shouldn't be anything for Hikaru to worry about too much. Now here, Hikaru, he just jumps in with his knight to c5, defending b7 in advance and pressuring the rook on b3, a very good multi-purpose move. And now Magnus says, you know what? We need to keep this rook on the b file. Rook to b6 played in the game. Now, that rook is very vulnerable. For example, a knight on perhaps d7 could target it later in the game, but there is no dark squared bishop, and overall, that means that rook will be relatively okay on that square. Now here, Hikaru, king to a7 is the move. We've seen this as a possibility throughout this game, and king to a7 here turns out to be quite a decent idea, not bad at all. Now, how does white want to continue? Well, here, Magnus does trade on e5. F takes e5 played in the game, and black takes back on the e5 square. Knight takes e5 as well. Now we have queen to b4. Magnus flying out with the queen. The point being, you are defending that rook on b6 in advance and pressuring the pawn on b7. Decently active move. And of course, there is this tension on the queens on this diagonal here. If that knight moves, the queens will be traded, but it's not a pin, as that queen on f8 is more than defended by these two rooks on the back rank. All right, Hikaru, he continues. Rook a to b8, a prudent move, defending that pawn on b7 in advance. If you don't do that, things could get very, very bad, very, very fast for a variety of reasons. For example, too many reasons to count. So instead, rook b8 played in the game, just defending b7 in advance. Now here, Magnus, he finds kind of an insane looking move at first glance, but there's a very simple tactical idea behind it. He goes for the move knight takes g7. The point being, this queen on f8 is completely overloaded. If you take on g7, then the knight on c5 is going to fall immediately. For example, queen takes g7 would be met by queen takes c5, simply picking up that knight. So here, Hikaru, he doesn't go for that. Instead, knight to c6 played in the game, retreating back with the knight and pressuring the queen on b4, as well as technically that pawn on a5. Now the queen has to move. Where should the queen go? In the game, queen to a3 chosen by Magnus Carlsen. And now Hikaru goes for a very critical central break in this position. He actually plays the move d4. The idea behind this, of course, if white takes on d4, black is going to take back either the knight or the rook and get a lot of activity. And as this game opens up, the white king on b1 is going to be more and more vulnerable. And that is what happens here. White takes on d4, and instead of recapturing with the knight, that makes a lot of sense. Instead, rook takes d4 played in the game. And now look at this. I mean, all of white's pieces are sort of awkwardly placed. They're not really doing a whole lot. And suddenly black, especially his two knights and his rook, his pieces are starting to get some activity. And you can see if the queen comes in, if the rook comes in, and so on, white's king on b1 could be in a lot of trouble very, very quickly. And of course, Magnus knows that. And so he starts knight f5, getting his knight back into the game. Of course, that wasn't necessary, as whenever black takes on g7, white could take on c5, if I can draw arrows correctly. But overall, that knight on g7 simply wasn't doing a whole lot for white's position. Therefore, knight f5 makes a lot of sense. Now we have for Hikaru, rook to a4, flying over with the queen, pressuring the queen, and skewering the rook behind the queen. We have queen to g3, sliding over with the queen, and then sure enough, rook takes a1, and then king takes a1. Now here, Hikaru, queen d8 is the move, sliding over with the queen, eyeing that g5 pawn, if I can draw arrows correctly, that g5 pawn. And of course, there's also the threat of queen d1 check, hitting the king. That could be dangerous. Now, the king does have the a2 square available for now, meaning that will not be an immediate checkmate. However, that will be very dangerous later in the game. Now here, Magnus, queen g1 is the move, respecting that threat. If I can get past this lag, queen g1 is the move, respecting the threat of queen d1 by Hikaru. And now Hikaru, queen d5, flying up with the queen, pressuring the a2 square and pressuring that knight on f5. Overall, Hikaru does seem to have kind of clawed back in this game so far. But of course, Magnus, he is not done attacking. And here, he busts out the very, very strong move b4, gaining space on the queen side. And now look at this. If this knight on c5 moves, then suddenly there's going to be all kinds of discovered attacks on the king. For example, if the knight goes to, I don't know, a4, then something like rook takes c6 would be very dangerous, as bang, the king would be exposed on this open diagonal. All right, the lag here is getting crazy. I can't seem to... I apologize for this, Chess YouTube. The lag is not allowing the eval bar to move at all. All right, in the game, queen to e5, chosen by Hikaru, targeting the king on the a1 square. Magnus goes king to a2, stepping out of the attack, and then Hikaru rook to c8, trying to get his rook activated. But here, white simply takes the knight on the c5 square. Again, the idea behind rook b8, if you don't do that, if you move the knight, say to e6 or anywhere else, then bang, rook takes c6, hits the knight and the king on the a7 square. So no matter what, you are simply losing material here as black. All right, b takes c5, chosen in the game. Then we have queen to c3 for Hikaru. Hikaru being down a piece officially. He is trying to hang on. He's doing his best. But of course, Magnus is going to make his life as difficult as possible. So rook b3 played in the game, targeting that queen on the c3 square. Now we have queen takes c2, gobbling up that free pawn, king to a3, the king marches up, then knight takes a5, but of course now with that knight not on the c6 square, suddenly that tactic of c6 is in the air, and here Magnus, he busts it out, c6 hitting the king. Now if you take with the knight on c6, then you're going to be setting up for all kinds of ideas, most notably queen b7, forcing the king back, and then queen b7 would be checkmate on the spot. So instead, king b8 chosen in the game, then we have queen to g3, flying up with the queen, targeting the king on the b8 square. Now, black goes rook to c7, trying to block the attack. Rook to c3, defends the pawn on c6, and targets the queen on the c2 square. Now, Hikaru, queen b1, sliding back with the queen. Then we have knight to d4, then b6, trying to defend, and then queen d6. Magnus slowly but surely closing in on the black king, and this is going to be a deadly finish right here. All right, queen to a1, targets that king on the c3 square. Then king to b4, the king marches up, knight to b7, Hikaru retreats the knight, and then here, the unbelievable finish to this game. Magnus Carlsen, you know what, good time for a pause. If you like, pause the video right now and try to find the key idea for Magnus right here in this position. He flies back, queen to f8, targeting the king on b8. The king goes to a7, and now the final move of the game, of course, knight to b5. The idea being, if black takes that knight on the b5 square, like for example, a takes b5, white simply goes rook to a3, forking the king and the queen. Black loses the queen, and then he's going to be down so much material. White's going to literally have, after queen takes, king takes, the queen and the bishop versus the rook and the knight. That is just too much material, and for that reason, way back in this position right here, Hikaru Nakamura simply resigns on the spot to Magnus Carlsen.